Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and I'm here from the Reacting to the Past Game Development Conference with Kyle Lincoln. He is a professor at Southeastern Oklahoma State University, and he is the designer of a game that I played this morning called 1492, The Forging of Spain. How you doing?
I'm well, Liz. Thanks for having me.
So, we had an exciting morning. Why don't you tell the public at large what your game is generally about?
Sure. So, the short version that I tell people in Nella Elevator is that it's a game about resolving a conflict between the Trastamara dynasty, so Fernando and Isabel on the one hand, and Muhammad XII, the last Sultan of Granada. That's what I tell people it's about. What it's actually about is how to resolve a really deeply rooted conflict between religious groups while still also counterbalancing the kind of diplomatic needs that you have to have after a century of warfare is finally wrapped up. So it's got a couple of things going on, but it's in a lot of ways about diplomacy, about religious identity, and about making deals at a time when it seems like a deal is impossible. So
yeah, I know about that from experience now because I got to play Fatima, the Dowager Queen of Granada. Mm-hmm. I was really just trying to preserve my son's dignity at this point because we had lost, the Spaniards were coming in, it was tough. So what feelings are you trying to create in students who are kind of on that losing side?
Yeah, so I think one of the things in general that Reacting does really well, but that I really wanted to highlight here is that it's really easy to see what happens historically and say that's what was supposed to happen, right? One of the things that Reacting really does well in this regard is to play with contingency, right? That individuals are making choices that then shape the outcomes. For the side that's losing, right, that's lost the war, that's not the only objective, right? You can lose a war, but be remembered as the guys that put up a fight or preserve the dignity of your religion, preserve the practice of your people, and could save face, right? So this is a classic example that I like to tell my students that if I played one-on-one against LeBron James, I will lose, right? Unless he is in a coma, I will lose. There's no question about that. It's LeBron. However, if I lose 100-1, I scored a point on LeBron. That's a moral victory for me at 5'7.5", 5'9" if I'm leaving the right 7-Eleven. There's enough of a moment where you can say like, okay, that was the kind of victory that was achievable and it was meaningful. Yeah. And so for the students that are on the Nasrid side, it's a lot more about what constitutes moral victory, right? And in some ways, it's making sure that the Pyrrhic victory, the Trastamaras, the Fernando and Isabella team are working for, is really a Pyrrhic victory, right? So they've lost so much in winning that they're now neutralized as a threat, which for them I think is a big win. And then for the international opinion characters, it's obviously about keeping the war from breaking out again and creating a lasting peace, which is a little trickier for them than they think they know at the start.
Indeed. And on the Ferdinand and Isabella side, things are a little difficult as well because you have people having to embody values that maybe aren't very comfortable. So Isabella was notably anti-Semitic. Yeah. There are religious primacy issues at hand. How do you write a game like that that's going to teach students about the issues and have them work through it, but in a way that's respectful?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Liz. I like to tell people that my goal is to introduce a version of religious prejudice to them that they have a strong reaction to, but that generates the antibodies and antigens that they want from it, right? We want the vaccine version of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, not the live virus, so to speak. And so one of the challenges is how do we make sure that religious prejudice is present and potent without being overwhelming? There are a couple of ways that we do that in this simulation. In the first place, we try to replicate some of the population dynamics. That is to say, most of the characters in the game are Catholic or Christian, and the next largest group is Muslim, and the third largest group is Jewish, which pretty closely replicates, at least in terms of proportion, the balance of the population in the peninsula, really. But at the same time, instances of prejudice are off stage, right? They don't happen voiced by characters. Instead, they have certain abilities and powers that replicate the potency for contemporary audiences of really, really harsh rhetoric, right? That is to say, people responded to anti-Semitism, people responded to racism, people responded to Islamophobia in that period, not because they were evil, but because that triggered their anxiety, right? They acted emotionally rather than intellectually, they acted emotionally rather than morally. And so then the challenge is, how do we make sure that the students can feel the impact of that rhetoric and understand that, no, in the 15th century, those things were okay to say, even if they were, sort of fringer.
Right.
They're still powerful, right? So one of the ways I've done this is with a series of special powers. All characters have some abilities, some things they can do. And most notably, students take a pre-game quiz, because of course these are teaching games, so we have to make them take a quiz. And whichever student gets the highest score gets what I've referred to as a carta de prejuicio, a charter of prejudice, a letter of prejudice, that allows them to symbolically, by holding up the form that they get, the prize form that they get, to embody using really harsh, virulent rhetoric to trigger a response, to sway people to their side, to eliminate a certain provision in a treaty or a ceremony, and really kind of replicate the impact while still keeping it far enough away so that if students have experienced Islamophobia and anti-Semitism of their own in their own lives, then that's far enough away to where you can say so it made somebody do something,
Right.
but not causing a full-blown panic attack in a student.
So speaking of special powers, there are also a lot of secret powers. Like one thing I really liked about this particular game is that there's a lot of skullduggery and indirect communication, a lot of use of kind of soft power and persuasion. How do you convincingly build something like that into a classroom simulation? And also, is that typical of reacting games? Because I feel like in the other ones I've been looking at, that's not present. So
I think there are definitely, one of the things that you can easily plot in a reacting game is how how macro and micro it is, right? So the biggest macro games, things like Yalta or the Rwanda simulation, where you have these huge international forces. On the micro level, you get things like Greenwich Village, which is all in one neighborhood in New York. And then the other end of the spectrum are the so-called great debate games, which are, as the name would suggest, parliamentary, legislative. And on the other end, the more social games that are a lot more about the kind of squishy in-between space. I've tried to make Granada a little bit more on the macro end and a little bit more on the social end, but there's still a very powerful great debate, sort of in the middle and up, I guess. And so for soft power questions, the real challenge is defining which characters have the hard power mechanisms, and then saying, okay, how do you construct a way for somebody to wedge or nudge one way or the other? And especially for characters that historically wouldn't have had, the ability to lead armies or arrest people.
Right.
That soft power is really important. And so often one of the ways you do that is by limiting hard power pretty stridently and then limiting access in general, right? So that the students who have that soft power, that access to go across factional lines, to go between groups or committees, really have a little bit more leverage because people need them because the boundaries are more enforced, right? The person who's in charge of a door, isn't very important in an open field of grass. But if you're in a big castle, the guy that's in charge of the front door is kind of important, right? Because they're controlling that access. And so that's one of the ways that I've really kind of made a push point for what they're up to in that period.
Right.
Yeah.
So for people who don't get the joy that I had this morning of spending several hours arguing about how a ceremonial handing over of Granada should take place, because obviously that's politically very important, and it was my job to make sure it wasn't too Christian and too shameful for me and for my son. So if you're going to go learn about the setting for 1492 and you can't play this game, which is super fun, what do you recommend that people out there read or look at in order to get like a good perspective on this that's not just Columbus?
Right. So I mean, in the first place, I think one of there's a really good series of books by Wiley Blackwell, which are the Wiley Blackwell Histories of Spain, and there's a really good volume in that set, which I think is either done by John Williams, not the composer, or Teo Ruiz. And those volumes are great. I think one of the most resonant portrayals for me is actually, I forget if it's a TV Cuatro or if it's Channel 5 series in Spain, which is actually a telenovela, a soap opera, but in the more Game of Thrones height, called Isabel, which is all about Isabel's pursuit of power and her role as queen. And I think one of the things that we mistake in this period, and there's some great work on Nostra Granada too, by all means. There's some really good, there's a great recent book by Brian Catloss called Kingdoms of Faith. There's a really good chunk at the end, the sort of last chapters about Granada. It's a big history of Islamic Spain. But I think there's a really good and really rich scholarly literature. I think one of the challenges for historians of Spain, for historians of medieval Iberia, is that we have great scholarship and then the popular stuff that comes out is garbage, or is transcendent, and there's no in between, right? So you'll get, books that are really evocative and really emotional, but that, dramatically misrepresent the scholarship and the sources, or you'll get books that are really great. Callis's Kingdoms of Faith is a great example, where they're really like powerful reads, but because they're not pushing on those emotional levers, they don't get, it's not the stream of 5-star reviews about telling the truth to the woke professors. And it's like, no, come on. Nobody's like that. But Kingdoms of Faith, I think, is a really great book for medieval Iberia in general. It's a really good history of Islamic Spain. There are a couple of great books about the history of Judaism, which I'll post as a reply to this video as a little pinned bit, because there's quite a lot of good out there. But the reason we spend a lifetime sifting through this stuff is because we're trained to sift through this stuff, and so hopefully we can save people a few bad books and push them towards the better ones. But
absolutely.
Yeah.
Kyle, thank you so much for giving us some of your time. If people have questions for you or want to know more about your game, where can you be found online?
So I have an academia.edu profile. That's mostly where I do stuff. And within the Reacting community, I'm pretty easy to find. I'm not a Twitter guy. I was on Twitter for all of a day and then just left.
How dare you?
It's not for me. But I'm all over for the Reacting consortium. I'm on the editorial board and the game development conference. So if people are interested in bringing Reacting into their classrooms, have Suitcase Will Travel, and there are a lot of ways to find me through those outlets too. So that's where I'm gonna go.
Fantastic. If you're watching this channel, you probably know I'm everywhere as Beyond Solitaire. So please like, subscribe, comment, ask questions, and most of all, happy gaming.